Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today here virtually for the second part of our Chicago Municipal Governance Symposium, sponsored by the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government and Crain's Business Chicago. My name is Sadi Sindhu, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Center for Effective Government, housed here at the Harris School of Public Policy. I'm thrilled to have a chance to say a few words about our work at the center and also kick off what promises to be a really interesting, timely conversation with our panel today. The Center for Effective Government has a vital and ambitious mission to strengthen democratic institutions and improve the capacity of government to solve public problems. Through our work, we seek to generate and elevate ideas from scholars and experts into the public square. Events like this, which bring together experts and practitioners to consider pressing issues and means of reform, are an essential component of this work. Last week, as part of this effort to dive into issues of government reform and democracy right here at home in Chicago, we launched an exciting new multi-part series with Crain's Business called One City, 50 Wards. This partnership brings together local leaders and experts for an in-depth discussion and dialogue to better understand the options, weigh the trade-offs, and consider the best levers to make our city government more effective. We hope you'll follow along with this series for the next few months, with new articles that come out each Monday morning. This past Monday, at the launch of this symposium, we heard from experts, Professor Jessica Tronstein from UC Merced, the University of Chicago's Justin Merlot and Christopher Berry, and Crain's columnist Greg Hines on representation, corruption, and the inner workings of the 50 mini-mayor system. During this insightful conversation, we explored hybrid city council systems, incentives for the pursuit of citywide goals, and coalition building across a diverse Chicago. I'm excited to continue this conversation today with power and efficacy of the City Council within and beyond Chicago, as we consider how our City Council collaborates with other government officials at every level and lobbies on behalf of the city on a number of critical policy issues. As a reminder, you can always learn more about this work by visiting our website at www.effectivegov.uchicago.edu and at Crain's Business at crainsbusiness.com. There you can sign up for our newsletters and for regular updates on this work and events. You can also find us on Twitter at UChicagoCEG and at Crain Chicago. Lastly, for all of you who are tuning in today, you are an important part of this conversation, and we've reserved a good chunk of time at the end for questions. Please feel free to drop a question for the panel by using our Q&A function, and we'll be sure to have those questions answered. With that, I'd like to thank you all again for being here today, and I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dylan Schaefer. Dylan is Assistant Director at the Center for Effective Government, who will now introduce our distinguished panelists. Thank you, Dylan.
Sadia, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today to introduce our panel of experts who are joining us, starting with Julia Payson. Julia is an assistant director in the New York University Department of Politics. During the 2020-2021 academic year, she was also a fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton University. Julia studies representation, political institutions, and public policy in state and local governments across the U.S. Julia, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Next up is Manny Perez. As Deputy Mayor of Intergovernmental Affairs in Chicago City Government, Manny led the day-to-day work of implementing the administration's legislative agenda across all areas, with a particular focus on Springfield as the current session comes to a close. Manny was the campaign manager for the mayor-elect's runoff election and served as the Intergovernmental Affairs Director for the transition team. He has led a variety of campaigns at the local, state, and federal level, including Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia's successful run for Congress in 2018. In Cook County government, Manny has served as special assistant to the president of the county board, chief of staff to the county clerk, and chief of staff to then Commissioner Garcia. Manny is also a 2016 alumnus of CEG's Civic Leadership Academy. Manny, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Thank you. And lastly is Justin Laurence. Justin joined Crain's Chicago Business in June 2022 to cover City Hall and county government. Prior to Crain's, he wrote for local outlets including Block Club Chicago, City Bureau, and the Daily Line. Justin has extensive experience covering Illinois' cannabis legalization push and has also tracked the Lightfoot administration, aldermanic politics, and neighborhood-level real estate development. Justin, thanks so much for being here. Last up, I'm going to introduce our moderator again this afternoon, Professor William G. Howell. William is the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago, where he holds appointments in the Harris School of Public Policy, the Political Science Department, and the college. He is also the director of the Center for Effective Government, as well as co-host of Not Another Politics podcast. He's written widely on separation of powers issues in American political institutions, particularly the presidency, and is going on research projects, origin of political authority, and the normative foundations of executive power. My pleasure to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Sadia. I'm so pleased to be joining in conversation with Justin, Julia, and Manny today to pick up this conversation about the city council here in Chicago, and to remind everyone, ours is a city council that's something of an outlier when you make comparisons around the country. We have 50 independent elected members to the city council, each serving individual wards. There are no at-large seats, and by reference to the sheer size of our city council, we're a huge outlier. Ours is much larger than any other city council in the country, save New York City, which has 51 members instead of 50. But note that in New York City, they're about 3.5 times as large as is Chicago. So we want to think about the relevance of these facts for the kinds of politics that unfold. And on Monday, we talked a lot about the significance of these facts for issues of representation, how the city council engages issue, how they evaluate policy, where their minds turn to the needs, the short-term local needs of their constituents within wards, and the extent to which they do, or in many cases do not, pay attention to challenges that affect the city as a whole. And we drew out that distinction at some length. And I'm hoping today we can turn the conversation a little bit to issues involving performance and relations between the city council and the many other political offices at the local, state, and frankly, national level that exercise power and that shape the content of policy. And so to get us started, Justin, I'm hoping I can turn to you. You've been a close observer of Chicago politics for a good long time. And could you just say a little bit about when you observe what's going on within the city council, what do you see at a kind of high level working really quite well, or working as intended? And what are domains in which or aspects by which the city council struggles? And this isn't by reference to any particular one alderperson, but kind of systemically. How do these? Where do we see the city council politics flourishing, and where is it struggling?
Yeah, I think this is a city council, and my experience has primarily been this actual city council since 2019, this term. But they work well, and essentially things where they defer to each other, defer to the local alderman in their ward. Every month they go through the zoning process, and there's really a ton of projects that are really only hinge on whether or not the local alderman supports that project or not. There's some exceptions, and those exceptions create big news, and they're a big deal, and we write about them and cover them. But on the most part, or on the whole, they kind of defer to each other. And if an alderman in Old Town supports a new apartment building in Old Town, then that goes through. And it's not just zoning, that includes capital projects in their wards, funding for schools, funding for parks and park buildings. So that's where they still do a really good job. And some people obviously complain about this process as well, but in terms of functioning, they do a good job of that. I think we'll spend a lot of today's conversation talking about where they don't do so well, and they don't really organize collectively to lobby other governments to work at the state level on fixes that need to happen in the city. They do that, but it's usually at the prompting of the mayor's office, of Manny when he was in that position, and others since then. So they're starting to become a little more independent than they have been. This city council, these 50 aldermen and the few replacements after some retirements are, they've stood up to the mayor some. They've fought the mayor on some big issues. Essentially, gave people like me interesting stories to write about, and probably gave Manny a few more headaches than the people his predecessors in that role had. So
gray hairs too.
Yeah, a few more gray hairs for Manny.
Okay, so the distinction you're drawing is one that is somewhat familiar to us relative to Monday's conversation, which is that there's a lot of deference when it comes to very local issues, particularly as they relate to zoning, and it performs well, as you pointed out, insofar as decisions are made. There are things are approved or not. Whether or not the right things are being improved is sort of a separate matter, but they're being approved as a function of whether or not the local alderperson supports it. And where there's opposition, then the rest of the city council tends to go along with it. But if I hear you right, where they struggle more is when there's an issue that cuts across ward boundaries that affects the city as a whole, and to try to build the kind of coordination that's needed to respond to an initiative that comes from, well, I mean, you were pointing to the mayor's office, it could be coming from the state government, but when it's citywide. Do I have this right?
Yeah. I mean, they do sometimes galvanize and work together on issues, but they kind of have to be led, right? Like the mayor's office says, this is a priority. We need this change in Springfield. Who's with us? We've all discussed this issue. An example is the Chicago casino. The state gaming act, the way it was written, at least gaming operators said this is really difficult for us to come into the city and work here and make a profit. And that was a change that happened during this administration. But that was really something that was led by the administration, and aldermen who supported that effort would do their part, speak to the state lawmakers they had a relationship with. But what I'm pointing out is these are usually things that come from outside. The mayor's office galvanizes them. They don't really do a great job of organizing themselves to fight for things that the city council may believe is important, but the mayor's office is really not acting on or is in opposition to.
Okay, Manny, let's talk about your gray hair, or your graying hair. So sitting as the deputy mayor of intergovernmental relations, not within the city council, but needing to work with the city council, and there's an effort to push through one initiative or another. How would you characterize what those politics look like and the challenges that you confronted when working with this body relative to where you were sitting, which is over in the mayor's office?
So I think it's, well, first of all, thanks. Thank you, Will, and thank you to the center for having me. As an alum, I really do appreciate this conversation and getting the opportunity to talk about municipal government. I think it was interesting, the issue and the point that Justin raised about zoning and sort of seeing how different aldermen defer to each other on zoning matters. From my perspective, I think I look at the challenges with dealing with the city council members in terms of, the city as a whole, and how each ward has various constituencies. And so each alderman is sort of elected to represent those different constituencies. So in some wards, you might have more police rank and file members. In other wards, you might have a more immigrant population. In some wards, you might be closer to downtown. And so these varying interests are always competing with each other in the form of elected members that are now in this body, who are there fighting for their constituents, and those constituents might differ drastically from the alderman next to them. So I think it was always a challenge in looking at, what policy initiative, what proposal from the mayor, and that she believed was important for the entire city, what was going to get passed in the city council. And one of the things that I would always say to the mayor and to my team is, we can get anything passed in the city council. The question is, what version of that are we going to get passed? And that's really where sort of the rubber, meets the road, is thinking about a policy initiative, a vision citywide, and then how do we get enough people on the city council to support? And in particular, how do we get at least 26 members of the city council to support that proposal?
Okay, so unpack that a bit for us. When you say what version, does what you have in mind that there are favors that need to be given? And I'm not talking about graft here. I'm talking about the standard kind of concessions that one makes in a political process to individual alderpersons who represent diverse interests. Is it about just counting votes and saying, well, this group over here tends to care a whole lot about this larger issue, but we need to shift it in some systemic way? We need to, ratchet it up or ratchet it down, what our ambitions might be. Like, unpack that for us a bit.
Yeah, so I would say I wouldn't call it favors. I think it's everything is a negotiation, whether you're in government or in business. And now I'm in the business sector. It's a negotiation. How do you get to a compromise where each side gives a little, and you get to a point where you're not entirely happy with what that looks like, but you're willing to move forward. And so I think it is about understanding what each alderman cares about. So I know from a public perspective, you have a lot of the zoning issues which are relevant, and development projects are certainly important, but a lot of the conversations that I had with aldermen were about trees that needed to be cut because roots were tearing up sewers for a particular homeowner in a particular corner. Or on the flip side, we were ripping up trees, and that alderman wanted more trees in their community. Or there were streets that needed to be resurfaced, or a viaduct was falling apart, and we needed to pull in 5 railroad companies that have jurisdiction over that viaduct. So those are some of the issues that they cared more about than a lot of the major sort of policy issues that would be covered in the media, right? And if we did those pieces well, if we were able to help cut through some of the bureaucracy, say we had a private contractor replacing a water main and they didn't clean up the street properly, or we had and an alderman got complaints about that, we would get that call. And if we were able to help push through and alleviate some of those issues, then I think we were in a better position to negotiate on some of the bigger, broader policy initiatives.
So, but if I take Justin's point, was that if you want to do systemic citywide reform, the initiative needs to come elsewhere. And you're saying, Manny, yep, okay, so here we are coming from the mayor's office, introducing something, say, on infrastructure change that's going to affect the city as a whole. What does it then mean to engage members of the city council? Well, the examples that you're providing are about then attending to their very local needs, right? It's about there's a particular block or even a particular house that is going to be disproportionately or adversely affected by a change or has a particular want or need. And if you guys can step in and attend to it, that then opens space or opportunity to advance a systemic change. But it's about meeting the members of the city council on their own turf, which is paying attention to the very local concerns that animate that institution. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, one last question before I turn to you, Julia, which is, imagine an alternative, which is that you've got a smaller number of alderpersons who are representing the city as a whole. You led by saying, look, we can get anything done. It's just a question of what it's going to look like. Does that calculus shift? Does the fact that you're interacting with 50 and they're all paying attention to very local concerns open up opportunities, or is it a sticking point and that makes life all the more difficult for the mayor in trying to advance policy change?
So I think that's an interesting question. And, I think the argument that I'm sure we're going to talk about is how do we, in cutting the council down, does that make it easier to get things done and passed? I'd like to put forward a different perspective on that because, and we can talk about cutting it down. I think what I just mentioned about the very localized issues, you would lose sight of some of that. So in some wards, you have turnout, which is incredibly high, and these are a very engaged electorate. In some, you have a population that is not as engaged or perhaps doesn't have the ability to vote. And yet, all of those constituents need to be serviced. And if you have more eyes on the ground, more folks that are attending to the needs of people, then perhaps you get better services for those constituents. So
right. So you get an expression of those very local concerns. I guess what I'm wondering is, to the extent that the mayor is then, though, thinking about the city as a whole, right? She's thinking about, sure, she cares about individual citizens, and residents of Chicago for sure, but she's also thinking kind of, what does a coherent infrastructure investment look like across the city? What do citywide interests look like, and how do we attend to them? Being forced to interact with and engage a legislative body that's hypersensitive and attuned to, and as you point out, with good reason in some ways, to the very local concerns, is that a problem for the mayor, or does it create challenges for the mayor, or does it open up opportunities on that? And maybe the answer is both.
I think it's both. I think it is. Obviously, there are challenges in trying to get to 26 votes and trying to get a governing coalition. But at the same time, you get a much more perspective that way. And you are able to get a better sense and probably more of a pulse on what's happening in each of the various communities, because Chicago is big and it's diverse. It's also incredibly segregated. And I think that's what leads to a lot of the sort of the diversity of the aldermen and the diversity of initiatives and interests that they're putting forward at the city council.
Super. So look, ours is a federated system of politics. There's all kinds of division, local, state, national, and all kinds of, within any space, take local, there are all kinds of intergovernmental tensions and challenges that come to play. And the city council's ability to advance its interests, however it understands them, crucially depends upon how it interacts with these other bodies, and lobbying plays an important role. When the city council speaks up to the state government and says, here's how we want you to think about the needs of Chicago or the needs of a particular ward. And I want us to think about how the relationship is between, or how the structure of the city council shapes those lobbying efforts. But before we do that, it's worth sort of clarifying what we mean by that lobbying. And Julia, you've not just written a lot on this topic, you've written the book on this topic. When we think about intergovernmental lobbying, what are we talking about?
Absolutely. When we talk about intergovernmental lobbying, we're really just talking about how our city officials trying to advocate for local interests in other levels of government, especially at both the state level and in DC. So how are city officials trying to navigate the system to make sure they are getting enough funding and to try to advance their policy agenda? And this is especially true at the state level because states historically have so much power over cities in terms of granting their charters and providing a lot of their funding. And also in some states trying to interfere with local policy by trying to pass preemption efforts. And so cities are very attuned to these types of dynamics and need to be sort of aware of their position within this intergovernmental space in order to be able to effectively advocate for local interests. And Chicago has some interesting sort of built-in advantages here, I would say, relative to many of the other cities that I study. Illinois is a strong blue state. They have a Democratic trifecta across state government. And so Chicago, isn't having to worry about some of the preemption efforts that we're seeing in, for example, red states in the South, where blue cities might have a very different sort of policy agenda or want different levels of city services or funding relative to what the state legislature is comfortable passing. And so in Chicago, we're not sort of seeing those type of dynamics. And Chicago's a big city, right, with a well-developed intergovernmental affairs team. We have people like Manny who are hired to sort of navigate these issues on the city's behalf. And so I'm actually really excited to be part of this conversation. And I have lots of questions about what this looks like in Chicago, because my specialty is more just cities in general, New York in particular, not necessarily Chicago. Going back to something that you said earlier, Will, like I was also thinking about, does this hyper local focus of aldermen sort of make it easier for the city vis-a-vis the mayor's office and the intergovernmental affairs team to coordinate their advocacy efforts and to sort of enact any change that they need in Springfield? I think Justin said, if the mayor says we need this change in Springfield, who's with me? They'll get it. And my sense is that this coordination is in the best interest of efficiently getting sort of what the city wants as a whole. In other contexts where I've seen a more divided city council and a less powerful mayor, you see the city sort of unable to agree on its advocacy priorities and not having as much influence at different levels of government. So my hypothesis would be that having the hyperlocal focus of the aldermen and having the well-developed staff in the mayor's office, it sort of streamlines things. But I would be curious to hear what Justin and Manny think about this. And I'd be curious how much input from aldermen the mayor's office gets and solicits when trying to craft sort of the intergovernmental policy agenda, because in order to advocate for local interests, you first need to have those defined and then have a plan in place, again, to sort of lobby or advocate in either Springfield or DC.
That's super. Before I turn to them, because I want to turn to them with exactly the question you just raised. It's a super one. Underscore for us, Julia, like what's in play when cities look up at states and the federal government? What are they looking for? I mean, when we think about Chicago policy, it's not just what goes on between the mayor and the city council. It's about what they can get from the state and what they can get from the federal government. So what are the types of things that flow from those governments?
Definitely. So the budget is always, the number one priority, and just wanting to make sure that a particular locality is getting its fair share of the funding that's being distributed. So of all things that cities lobby for, state and federal budgets are always among the most contested issues. From place to place and time to time, there are different policy areas that a city might be really focused on, whether it's addressing homelessness, trying to redevelop particular areas, trying to get funding for public transportation that requires state authorization. So those sort of temporal policies, it's very contingent and it changes. And this is where I think having the flexibility and nimbleness of the mayor's office being able to sort of quickly identify a particular issue and then go to Springfield and get the Chicago delegation on board. This strikes me as being potentially advantageous to having to coordinate across a large and divided city council. But yeah, beyond funding or particular policy issues, again, I think the most exciting battles that are happening are often in states that are trying to preempt local policies, where, a local city might try to pass a higher minimum wage law, and then the state comes in and says, no, you can't do that. And again, Chicago is not having to deal with this, which, I do wonder how much the fact that Chicago has these built-in natural allies sort of in Springfield and has this sort of Democratic majority that it's usually dealing with, how much does it not actually have to worry so much about perfectly crafting its intergovernmental advocacy efforts because there's already so many built-in advantages versus a city that is facing these uphill battles to getting the policy and funding that it wants?
Austin looking up at Texas state governor who is hardly blue in his political in terms of his politics. And it's in that space, I mean, your own research has shown where you see governments, local governments, hiring actual lobbyists to act on their behalf in order to bridge that partisan gap.
Yes. So in addition to intergovernmental affairs teams, it is very common for cities to also hire contract or professional lobbyists or lobbying firms. And Chicago does this. And I would be curious, Manny, how much your office relies on these outside professional folks versus trying to do more of this work in-house. I think the benefit of being able to hire or contract with professional lobbying firms is they have these built-in ties to legislators in different levels of government. And so one common thing that I see is if there's ever a wave election that brings in a new crop of partisans to state government, where state government switches hands politically, cities will often scramble to hire professional lobbyists that have ties to the incoming party and to the incoming legislators as a way to sort of bridge those gaps where you can't rely on your natural allies who sort of ascended through the Chicago delegation and can get you everything you want. So again, this happens, I suspect, less in Chicago, but certainly in many cities that I've studied, the reliance on professional lobbyists is a huge part of the story. And I think there's pros and cons, which we can talk about during this conversation.
Manny, when you're sitting over at the mayor's office, and it isn't just that you were looking over at the city council, you were looking up at the state government and wanting to say, hey, we need funds, or you need to pass one type of policy or another. Because you were looking up at Democrats, both up and over, all around, for the most part, in terms of who was in control, did you feel like you were playing from a position of strength in the way that Julia is describing?
Yes and no. I think we do have sort of natural allies in the state legislature, in that the city, mostly, a Democratic city, democratically controlled legislature. But we did have some divisions along ideological lines. And, one example that comes to mind, and I think this was a couple years ago, and so I can talk a little bit more about it, even though it might percolate here in this election cycle, but it had to do with the real estate transfer tax and changing the real estate transfer tax in the city. Currently, it's a flat tax. So if you sell a home, for $250,000, or you sell something for $1 million or $5 million, you pay essentially the same flat tax. And so one of the initiatives that we undertook early on in the administration was to change that tax and make it a progressive transfer tax, so that if you sold a higher value home, you'd pay more in taxes. And that change could bring in the city probably about $100 million annually. Now, there was a group that had organized around this change and that wanted the entirety of that increment to go towards homelessness and fund those types of services. We were faced with a situation where we couldn't quite change it as quickly as we wanted to at the city council level, and we had to go to the state. And so we gathered our allies, we went to the state. However, we couldn't get it done at the state because a couple of the natural allies for us had aligned themselves with the group that wanted to make sure that these dollars were spent on homeless services. And so we were negotiating both at the state and at the city council, and it just didn't move, the ball forward. Where I was making an argument to folks, hey, it's going to be hard enough to get this passed at the state level because we're going to need some more moderate Dems and Republicans, where something like an increase in the transfer tax might be viewed as an increase to taxes on property, or property tax increase. And for the political consultants out there, you already know how that can appear on a mail piece or an ad. And so it was going to be challenging enough getting it done at the state. I wanted to negotiate at the city. We weren't able to do it. We were sort of our own worst enemy in that regard. And so that the transfer tax remains the same. It's still a flat tax. And I know it's become an issue in this cycle.
Justin, when you see the city of Chicago looking up at the state government, are members of the mayor's team and the city council, are they harmonizing? Are they able to speak with sort of one voice because they're overwhelmingly Democratic and they're speaking to a legislature that is at least, it certainly leans left? Or are there important rifts that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think there's important rifts that we need to be aware of, I guess, and the short answer. I'm thinking Manny and I have both been in the city council chamber during budget season, and they have these annual budget hearings where every department comes in and they talk about their budget and aldermen grill them, and it's a whole day affair. And it's almost, this comes up annually where aldermen push for something. They're pushing for something that they've been arguing for 6 years, or there's an alderman who's, I've been fighting for this for 6 years, and every year we're told that we need a change at the state level, and that's why we can't do this. And every once a year, the same kind of similar aldermen say, this is why we need to get a caravan and literally go down there and advocate on our behalf. And I sit there and I think I heard that conversation last year, and I'm very confident that I'm going to hear it again next year, and it's going to be the same argument. And the reason that these sort of caravans don't happen is because there's not, the city council is fractious, and not everybody agrees on this certain policy issues that they should go down and change. I mean, the real estate transfer tax is a good example. There's certainly aldermen who if they advocate for any sort of increase in property taxes, that like Manny said, that's their head on a platter in the next election. So I think with all these things, it's helpful to think of the city council as what I've really learned is there are no permanent coalitions on the city council. They kind of meld and form around one particular policy issue, and they vote on it. They get the 26, 48, whatever amount of votes, and then they split apart and they come back for the next one, and it doesn't always look the same. And that happens on the issues that they need, state help with as well. So sometimes they're working at cross purposes as well. I'm thinking about, so we just went through our remap, ward redistricting. And during that process, and Manny might know more than this is like one of those things that people like me are asking Manny to spill the beans on for a year. So he might know more of the details than I do, but essentially, the alderman who's in charge of the committee that the ward redistricting goes through, went to Springfield and basically asked for a lower threshold of votes to approve the map, essentially just making it easier so you didn't have to get to this 41 vote supermajority. And that really split the city council. Like, that was not everybody agreed that was a good thing. The Latino caucus kind of caught wind of that and argued against it, and eventually it wasn't passed. But there's just lots of things that happen on city council where they really work at cross purposes, and I'm not arguing that they shouldn't. They had different aims in that remap fight. It was really, in Chicago, it's really fought on demographic and racial lines, our ward map fight. But this all happens in sort of one-off situations, I guess, is how I think about it. There's not some sort of cohesive unit or coalition of aldermen that advocate for one thing all the time and kind of stick together, if that helps you think about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're characterizing politics that are perennially fractious, that coalitions are almost always coalitions of convenience, and that the ties that bind are reasonably weak, and they are a function of whatever happens to be bubbling up at one particular moment. But let's bring this back, Julia, to you, which is your provocation was, hey, we've got all kinds of alignment in terms of the partisan composition of the city council, the party of the mayor at the state level. That ought to allow for kind of clear lines of communication and a coherent articulation of what Chicago interests are. But I think what Manny and in particular Justin are pointing to is that there's all kinds, it's actually quite fractious within Chicago, which presents then challenges for the ability of Chicago as the governments that constitute Chicago to articulate what should go up and how the state ought to respond to one challenge or another, and that those things are defined by, Justin, you're pointing towards the importance of race for sure, ethnicity for sure, but also you can think about, again, these deeply local ties that are channeled through the city council, that this schism, maybe the schism's too strong, I'm going to say a schism between the city council and the mayor, where the mayor's paying attention to the city as a whole, and all the alderpersons are thinking, no, it's my ward, and where can I get carve out my exception, my local interest attended to? That creates tensions and challenges when they try to come together and send up a well-defined request that has a chance of succeeding at the state level. What do you think, Julia?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is, as fractious as it is and as difficult as it is to form these coalitions, imagine if you had the Tennessee or the South Carolina or North Carolina state legislature, where not only are you, dealing with these issues, but throw in, not even just divisions among Democrats, but Republicans as well. I think the benefit of having sort of the party alignment is that at least you sort of can pick up the phone and get the conversation started, even if there's going to be disagreement about how exactly to get there. And I guess it seems like there would likely be certain issues that are more likely to sort of trigger sort of the fractious nature of 50 different aldermen with different hyperlocal concerns versus issues where the mayor can sort of legitimately step in and say, no, I have the vision here. I know what the city needs, and have the deference of the city council to her. And so I would sort of be curious, are there particular issues where it's easier to have that sort of streamlined agreement about, here's the city priority, here's how we're going to communicate it to Springfield, versus other issues that trigger the scrutiny from all the different mini mayors, and that make it impossible for the city to agree on, let alone articulate the agenda. So yes, I completely agree. Politics is always going to be contentious, and both Justin and Manny provided some great examples of times when policies sort of failed to cohere and have Chicago get exactly what it wants. But yeah, I'd be curious sort of what the conditions are under which it's easier or harder, and whether certain issues are more likely to get passed.
Mayor Manny, you're looking up at the state government and you're thinking, I want to articulate a particular view on behalf of Chicago. Are there some where you say, I've really got to bring the city council on board, and I've got to do a lot of work to cultivate their support? And are there others where you can say they're going to go along for the ride no matter, and so we just have to figure out what it is that we want?
I think you always want to have the support of the city council, so that you don't have council aldermen working across purposes with representatives at the state legislature. And I think, the city is very limited in what it can do in terms of raising revenue and paying for its costs. A lot of those levers are pulled at the state. And so, when we have ideas on, great ideas. Some of the ones that Justin referenced and that come up during budget season, most of the time the administration is responding, well, that's done at the state level. We can only do it at the state level. That's really the challenge is how do we work closer with the state, and how do we have all of our aldermen aligned to ask the state to give us more levers to pull to bring in resources for the residents of the city.
So, but are there some issues where you'd say that the task of getting them on board, again, this is from the vantage point of the mayor, right? Looking over at the city council, you'd say this is going to be a heavy lift. This one, getting either the active or tacit support of a critical majority or supermajority of the city council is just going to be really difficult, even though it's clearly from the mayor's vantage point in the interest of a city. Whereas this other one is, look, if we just go over and let them know, they won't get in our way. Can you think of either, it could be by policy domain or some areas where it's just you've got greater runway, and other ones where it's a tougher road to hoe?
Yeah, it's hard to think about it in terms of topics. I guess I'll say whichever one doesn't have any interest groups attached to it that have an influence on the city council, those are probably easier to get people on board. If there's some sort of group that is lobbying or that has been able to convince some council members of the opposite perspective, then that's going to be more challenging. But the real estate transfer tax example was one where I thought it was a sort of a slam dunk. Let's get something done at the state level, and let's figure out or fight amongst ourselves here at the city how we split up the additional revenue that's coming in. But let's get the revenue first, and we couldn't get that done. And I think we were counting on that. We actually put that in our budget, our first budget in 2019, and we had to amend it and take that out because we were counting on that revenue to come in. Yep. So no, there isn't I can't think of, hey, if we're doing a certain policy area that's going to be easier than others. I think it really is dependent on which groups are drumming up support with aldermen.
And I was just going to add, and I think this is something that's happened since Manny left government, but on some of kind of long flow of revenue, it seems to be harder for the city to convince the state to change, and there's big changes that the state would have to make. But sometimes on other issues like I'm sorry, something very loud just fell next to me. The city recently, I think it was 20 million. I don't know the exact number, but we've had this influx of migrants come, a lot of them sent from Texas, and the city was really strained in the capacity to kind of immediately care for them and set up more permanent housing. And so the city did, my understanding is that the mayor's office did get probably more members of the Latino caucus to really advocate around that. And they did get, I believe, 20 million, which was not the number they asked for. They asked for more, but I can imagine a scenario, and like Julia's talking about in other states where it's Republicans in charge, that is a much harder ask right now than it is in Chicago and in Illinois.
I want to remind our audience that they can submit questions, and we want to encourage them to do so. Some are starting to roll in, and we're going to turn to them in just a second here. But before I do, Justin, if I could come back to you, which is how a lament that I've heard when it comes to Chicago politics is that ours is a city that is governed by a strong mayor and a dysfunctional legislature, and that anything of consequence that gets done doesn't get done through the cooperation and deliberation and negotiation in a fair-minded way between mayors and alderpersons. It comes through a heavy-handed mayor driving through systemic reform, and that while some alderpersons may lament that, they can't do much about it precisely because they're so fractious and there's so much dysfunction that runs through it. There is a charged characterization of our politics. How fair is it? I'll give you, and Manny, I'll come back. I'll let you weigh in on this too, because I'm sure you've got a point of view about the matter. But Justin, yeah.
I think overall it's a fair view that a lot of citywide legislation starts in the mayor's office, or sometimes it starts with an idea from an alderman and then it gets co-opted by the mayor's office and repackaged as the mayor's idea. I think that happens in Chicago quite a bit. So I do think broadly it's a fair view, but I do, at least on this city council in this term, like there have one major example. I mean, the city council passed essentially a new community elected board to oversee the police department. And this is certainly something that the mayor campaigned on and she advocated for, but those talks really broke down, and they were at a cross point where I don't know that it was going to pass or that something was going to be approved. The mayor had kind of withdrawn from talks there was two kind of advocacy groups within the city council pushing for slightly different versions of this board. And, the mayor had kind of broken off talks with them as far as I know. And I really think it was revived by those two city council coalitions coming together and kind of compromising and coming up with a plan and then more or less, forcing it back onto the mayor's office. Manny might disagree with this kind of simplistic view of it, but it would not have passed, I believe, without the mayor's support, and she ultimately did get involved and make a few changes to the compromise legislation and that she could support, and it eventually passed. But I do think, and I've spoken with aldermen, they point to that as something where they realize, I guess maybe realize their own power and influence to, if they're working together and kind of just forging on something, that they can get it done. I'm curious if Manny thinks everything I just said is junk and that this one of, it was really the mayor's office that pushed this through. But
what do you say, Manny?
Yeah, I would say it was part of what you said, Justin, was, I think, accurate in that, the talks broke down early on. There was a lot of momentum to get something done early in the administration. Talks broke down. These two advocacy groups were still out there, each with varying levels of support on the council. And then they came together, but still did not have, I think, enough support to get something passed. And I think at that point, I was heavily involved in that, in that negotiation and being in the room. I mean, literally going line by line in that piece of legislation, making sure that the people in the room were supportive, making sure that the mayor was on board as well. It was one of the most challenging pieces of legislation to get done because of the varying interest. But there was a willingness to collaborate and an understanding that coming together with this group and with the mayor, that we were going to be able to get something done, and approaching it with sort of that perspective and seeing what the end product would be and getting something passed. I mean, reiterating to the coalition that we were there to get something passed, and our perspective was in trying to get aldermen to support this version of the ordinance. I wish it were as easy as the characterization of a strong mayor that says something and that the council does it. I certainly would have made my job a lot easier to get things passed. I think it's more it had to be more collaborative. We had to strike more of a compromise. We had to really understand, even with allies, in that piece of legislation, even with people that I'm sure from the outside folks were saying, well, these particular aldermen are aligned with the mayor. They're going to be totally on board with whatever version she signs off on. That's not always the case. You have to bring people on board. You have to convince them. You have to give them, your perspective as to why this is important. And it's never easy. It's always messy. Democracy is messy.
Julia, when you look at cities across the country and you think about the ability of cities to lobby state and national governments, Do you see, or do we see much variation in terms of whether or not the mayor's out in front, the city council's out in front, some kind of collaboration between the two? Do we see variation on that front, or is it routinely the mayor who is exercising disproportionate influence, even though, as we've just, Justin and Manny have made clear, that doesn't mean that the mayor always gets precisely what he wants. What do we see in terms of variation across the country?
I think it's really only in the largest cities that the mayor sort of routinely acts as that spokesperson. I mean, in many cities across the country, we have either weak mayor forms of government or sort of council manager forms. And so, thinking from that more comparative perspective, city council usually plays a much larger role in crafting the intergovernmental agenda. And, I think there's pros and cons insofar as you are getting more input from people representing different parts and portions of the city. But I think it can also really slow down the process. And especially when we see divided city councils, it can be really difficult to craft a coherent intergovernmental agenda. So I think in general, the cities that have stronger mayors tend to have a bit of an advantage. This is a big generalization. But having that person who is already sort of seen as legitimately representing the interests of the city as a whole just makes a natural advocate for those interests in other levels of government. So in general, it seems like places with strong mayors maybe are a little more efficient in their lobbying efforts. But again, this is generalizing. We have lots of local governments and lots of cities all across the country.
Great. If we could I'm going to turn to some of the questions. And the first one is encouraging us to turn our attention to the role of agencies. It isn't just mayor, city council. There are agencies that are performing in a bureaucracy that performs all kinds of functions. And Manny, you were pointing to earlier a great strength of, and you too, Justin, a great strength of the existing city council is its attention to the need for local services. And that, if a tree falls down, I know who to call. I call the alderperson and then I can get that solved. But we've got a question coming in about whether or not that should be the appropriate role, right? Is the role of the alderman policy or services? Should the role of aldermen be ensuring their residents receive the services they need, or should they be should their job principally be about deciding policy, wherein when, my tree falls, I can call an agency that will act upon that policy and attend to the local need that I'm bringing forward. What do you think? Justin, I'm going to go to you first. How about that?
I'd hope you'd stick with Manny on that one first.
Yeah, keep him on the hot seat. We're going to come to it.
Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, I'm relatively new to Chicago. I've been here 6 years, so I guess I'm not that new, but a lot of the times when I'm sitting in city council listening to fights, often I'm thinking it doesn't have to work like this. Like I've lived in other cities and I've thought my garbage was relatively picked up on time and service trees got cut down and I didn't really think about it or notice it. And Chicago is very territorial on that, like that. No, our way of doing it is best. We can't have these unelected bureaucrats, is something aldermen often say, deciding this stuff. So I don't know that I have an answer on this. I do think that because this is the way that we've always done it, that we're kind of protective of it, and especially aldermen themselves. I mean, if you are a good ward level services alderman, you're going to be very hard to be knocked off in an election. Like if your residents believe that you attend to their needs in that way, then you've got an easy ticket back to city council every 4 years. So I think that's part of it. And aldermen are also reluctant to give up power because it does come back on them. If the city, Manny might know that exact timeline, but the city moved its trash collection services from a ward-based service where you have trucks based in the ward and to more of a grid-based, trying to be more efficient and spend less money and hopefully do it better and provide better services. And it's aldermen kind of want that back. The last budget was, they didn't get it back to a ward level basis, but essentially from what I heard is not that this new system is terrible. It's that when there's breakdowns in this new system, I get all the blame and I have no input on how to change it. So I don't know that anybody would argue that it has to go back because it's a better way of collecting trash. It's that it's a better way of having some control over it. And if Johnny calls in and says my trash hasn't been picked up for 2 days, I can call someone and it gets picked up that afternoon. And there's that kind of immediate level of accountability.
Which serves the political needs of the alder persons insofar as they can be responsive to needs and wishes and wants. And in being responsive, they can shore up their electoral prospects going forward. But you said, and it is true, this is how we've done it here in Chicago for a long time, but the lead in here is that Chicago looks awfully different from most other, at least when it comes to the design of the city council, looks awfully different from major cities all across the country. And we could think about a more responsive, better functioning administrative state at the local level, administrative agencies that would perform these functions, and that the public might learn to turn to them and not expect their alderperson because they're flourishing, at least as a possibility. No, Manny?
Well, I think yes. I think services are incredibly important, and I think we're having a conversation about 50 aldermen, which obviously was a big part of my job while I was at the mayor's office. But the city has over 30,000, I think, employees. We've got 34 departments. You've got thousands of people that are working day in and day out to make the city work. And the overwhelming majority of those folks are there for public service because they care. They're politically astute, but not politically motivated. And so when it comes to services, yes, we should have better services. I think the public should have the ability, and they do, to log in these concerns, the trees, the garbage cans, etc. But what do you do when the issues are more complicated? And I'll give you an example. There's an alderman who grew up with this viaduct, on the south side, that had never been really repaired, that had a number of issues, that was too low and trucks were passing by it, so they kept hitting the ceiling and the concrete started to disintegrate. There were 5 rail lines that cut across that viaduct. Who was going to pull together those railroad companies? It was a city road, so CDOT, the Department of Transportation, had jurisdiction. We had to replace a water main. So then you brought in the Department of Water Management, and there were some state regulations, EPA regulations, that prevented the way you had to lay out these new mains and the distance from sewer lines. So that's a very complicated issue. You can't just log that on 311. Who's going to be the champion that's going to say, hey, everyone get together, let's figure it out. Let's work on a solution, because it's very easy to be in a massive bureaucracy and say, this is what I'm taking care of. You need to, talk to that other person in that department to take care of that other issue. So you do have, I think there is value, and a lot of the aldermen really care deeply about, services and also getting projects off the ground. So there is this zoning component that people look at, but it's not just a matter of zoning in the city. There are incentives, whether those are county incentives. Who's going to champion this with the county? There are state incentives, regulation. Who's going to champion that? There has to be someone that is pushing that cares about what's going on a block by block basis. And now, I know there was a question about the size of the city council, and don't get me wrong, it would have made my job a whole lot easier if there were less than 50 aldermen. But I'm trying to get folks to understand that, that there is another perspective as to, and it's really one that I grapple with, as to what happens when you shrink the number of aldermen in the city.
We have a question about corruption, and as it relates to what's being described as the Democratic trifecta. Julie, I'm going to bring this to you. You were talking about how this continuity in terms of the partisan composition from the state to the local facilitates bargaining and negotiation and the articulation of reasonably well-defined citywide interests. But when you have one-party governance, is that not a breeding ground for corruption? Which, if at the end of the day, what we care about is not just the articulation of citywide interest, but also issues involving performance. And we think that corruption is going to undermine or the ability of a city to actually solve its local problems. Is having a one-party cities, is that a blessing or is it a curse?
Yeah, I think it sort of depends how that party came to power and whether we think elections are sort of operating freely and fairly. Historically, when we think about political machines that have ironclad control of government at all levels, they're not necessarily getting that power in a fair way. But I think if you have transparency initiatives in place, if you have, elections that are working as they should, then there's nothing wrong if people have sort of congruent interests and want to elect in a slate of candidates that all share that ticket. I think that's part of the democratic system. And in fact, I think a lot of the threats to democracy now are sort of gerrymandering efforts or redistricting efforts that are trying to artificially break that up. So I think that the answer is it sort of depends how much do we think this trifecta is the result of dirty play or putting fingers on scales versus this is the will of the people and we have transparency and corruption initiatives in place and our elections are being overseen. So I think it's a contingent question. And interestingly enough, given some of Chicago's history, it's been an interesting city in terms of advocating for transparency initiatives. And there have been some very interesting efforts to address corruption and sort of ensure that the city is working based on that history. So I actually am kind of bullish and don't think it's so much a problem. I'm much more worried about Republican gerrymanders in other states other than Illinois than I am about the Democratic trifecta.
But if we think about the need for oversight and accountability, you and I are from the same party. We were both freely, independently elected in a dominantly democratic city, and here we are. And so it's not that the machine is doing any particular kind of work. It's that here we are. The fact that we benefit from each other means at the margin, I'm going to be less likely to call out your misbehavior and you're less likely to call out mine. And in that sense, corruption can propagate from the fact that we come from the same party. And that's not a rap on voters. It's not a rap on the role of parties per se. It's just the willingness of us to step out and to say, you know what, Payson's doing something that she shouldn't be doing, or Howell's doing something he shouldn't be doing. It's less likely to be articulated. In that sense, the corruption can propagate.
Sure. But, again, if we have transparency information initiatives in place where we're sharing information with the public, if we have journalistic oversight, if we have abilities to call this behavior out, in theory, we should then see either moderate or progressives aligning themselves around this bad behavior, or Republicans even having a chance to call it out. So there should, in a democratic system, there should be correctives to this. So maybe there is an incentive for that type of collusion, but you shouldn't be able to get away with too much without opening an opportunity for somebody to say, hey, this behavior is bad, I will run for office now. I think it's an open question, though, ultimately, right? Like I can see it going both ways. But I think one very simple step is just making as much information publicly available about things like lobbying contacts, or meetings, or just, all of the ways in which we think that corruption might be happening behind the scenes. Like, how can we put sunlight on this, make it transparent so that the public and journalists can exercise their oversight role? I don't know what Justin.
Yeah, but I was just about to say, this is, Justin, where you come in, right? Where the central role, when we think about a well-performing, responsive, and not corrupt city government, crucially depends upon a free and independent press, shining light. We're approaching the end here, and I want to give you each an opportunity, if we could, to become dictator for the day, and to be given an opportunity. I did this on Monday, to change the size of the city council, if you so like. Manny, you've said I'm torn this way, that way, so you got to sort it out, right? And I'm going to go to you last, and you got to say, do we want to keep it at 50 and have it be exclusively ward-based elections, or might we have some be at large? Or do we want to enlarge it? Do we want to we want to make it even larger? Do you want to shrink it? You're dictator for the day. You can make a difference. Julia, you get to go first. What are you going to do?
Sure. It has been working for hundreds of years. I kind of like the service-based aspect of the ward system. I think the mayor is a natural person to enact policy that affects the whole city, and then a way to then have hyper-local interests represented sort of makes sense through the ward system. I don't think it's perfect, but it's sticky. It has worked up to this point. And I think this idea of, does the council need to do more policy passage? I think it sort of depends how happy people are with outsourcing that to the mayor. But if it's working, let's keep it.
One vote for the status quo. Justin.
I have just now gotten my head around 50 aldermen and gotten to know them and gotten to know the different wards and what goes into getting elected in each of the wards, that I'm very hesitant to say that I want the number to be shrunk. But yeah, I have a hard time seeing it moving. Aside from what I would do as dictator, I have a hard time. If I was dictator, I might choose another fight, I guess I would say. There was an alderman who, pretty influential alderman, who told me, going into the remapping process, he wanted to introduce this. He thought there should be less aldermen, 30 aldermen, and told me this probably in 2019, well before the remap started. And I came back to him closer to it, and he was, he essentially just said, I ran that by my colleagues, and got shown the door in a lot of conversations. So I guess I'm just resigned to it, and I'm happy to kind of learn about it and write about it.
Okay. I'm going to call that a weak vote.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Soft vote.
I criticize politicians all the time for giving wishy-washy weak answers, so I should have to take it too.
All right. Manny, are we going to go 3 for 3, or are you going to change it?
No, I think we have to go 3 for 3. I think we've got to keep it, and I think we've got to figure out, how we get more stuff done in the city. One of the things that I enjoyed about talking with all the aldermen and understanding the issues was really getting a sense for the pride they'd have to for the city, and the loyalty to the city. Like, these are folks that are not going to go anywhere, right? And they care about their neighborhoods. They care about making their wards better. I think we got to work on, giving them the bigger picture and seeing and telling them this is what makes the city better.
All right, I'm just here to tell you, you guys were uniform support for the status quo. On Monday, we went 4 for 4. They all wanted to switch it to 30 members. So we'll have a battle royale at some future date. We'll sort that out. I want to thank you all for joining us, and invite Dylan to come back on.
Will, thank you so much for leading us through that conversation. And thank you again to Julia, Manny, and Justin for your really insightful contributions. I think it certainly between today and Monday, there's been some really incredibly fascinating and timely discussion about some critical issues. So thank you all. I'd also like to shout out my colleague, Dion Lamel, who's sitting behind the scenes today, but who has really been the chief architect behind this symposium for all his hard work on behalf of our team. So thank you, Dion. As a reminder to all of you at home, you can learn more about our work on our websites, effectivegov.uchicago.edu and chicagobusiness.com. And we also encourage you to follow along with us and join the conversation on Twitter as well. So on behalf of both the UChicago Center for Effective Government and Crain's Chicago Business, thank you all for joining us here today for our two-part symposium on municipal governance. We hope to see you again soon. Have a good day.